Tonight, Clara Thiel is going to talk about rare plants and habitats of Western Maryland. Clara is a lecturer of biology and the coordinator of biology internships at Frostburg State. In addition, she curates the Frostburg State University Herbarium. Clara comes from Clark County, Virginia. She earned her bachelor's degree from James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. She earned her master's degree in applied ecology and conservation biology from Frostburg State. And Clara currently teaches courses in plant systematics, forest ecology, and field identification. Her current research focuses on insular ecosystems and edaphic plant communities throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. And I'm thrilled that Clara is going to speak to us tonight.
All right, thank you so much, Liz. Thank you all for having me today. I love talking about this subject. I am from Virginia, like Liz mentioned, but I have been living in Maryland since I came here for grad school in 2019 and have worked in various ecosystems throughout Maryland and have just fallen in love with a lot of the species that are here. And I'm just thrilled to be able to share some of my photos and my favorite botanizing places and species with you guys today. So focusing on rare plants and ecosystems, especially of mountain Maryland, for our presentation this evening, I'm going to just give you guys a brief overview on rarity and how those ranks are applied at the state and global levels. And then I'll dive into talking about a selection of ecosystems and some of the special species that they support throughout Washington, Allegheny, and Garret counties. And then just wrap up with a little bit of discussion related to conservation of those species systems and some of their implications. So first, starting with ecosystem rarity. So ecosystems themselves are also considered rare or can be considered rare. And the components that go into ranking such ecosystems are based on essentially their biogeographical history. How common are they throughout their range? How large of an area do they take up? But of course, today we have a lot of impacts to those natural systems, including habitat loss and degradation. So a lot of habitats that are already uncommon throughout their range are or have been depleted, and then also therefore impacting the species that they support. So we also tend to see that most ecosystems that are rare also support rare species. And that's usually because these ecosystems themselves can be considered what we call biodiversity hotspots. They tend to be areas that have disproportionately high numbers of rare and uncommon species in relation to their overall diversity. And these ecosystems that are rare are often because they are specific to a certain part of the landscape, and they usually only support species that are highly specialized and usually also tend to be poor competitors. And these small habitats can be seen of as ecological islands. They're going to be a habitat that's surrounded by some kind of other habitat matrix that is unrelated to that specific habitat type. So these ecological islands are also referred to as insular ecosystems. They're insular in nature, and they tend to be maintained by natural stress or natural disturbance regimes. So this could be, when I mean stress, it could mean anything from a stressful topography, very steep slopes, or certain geologies. Some parent material can be stressful for the plants based on their pH, or different hydrological regimes such as standing water or high intensity river scour can all be some type of abiotic stress or disturbance that maintains these ecosystems as more open. They're not going to become a typical forest ecosystem. So because they're maintained as an earlier successional habitat type, this is where they tend to support those highly stress resistant species. And this is where you get that weird species diversity that you see there and nowhere else, or at least not in similar or adjacent habitats. We tend to also have high levels of endemism, which is when you have species specific to a very small specific area, and adaphism, which is where you have species restricted more or less to certain habitat, or sorry, certain soil characteristics, especially. So we have these bizarre or uncommon combinations in topography or soils or stress, and that's what gives rise to these uncommon or rare insular ecosystems. Now, when we're talking about species rarity, a lot of the components are similar. How large is their range? How large is the area of occupancy within that range? How large are the general population sizes and how viable are they? How many are truly reproducing? How many occurrences or populations? And also, do they have some kind of special ecosystem requirement? Are they reliant on a specific soil characteristic or disturbance regime? Other conditions or factors that can also influence species or ecosystem rarity are especially linked to invasive species or anthropogenic influences that are in relation to short and long-term population trends. So how intense is the threat? How ongoing is the threat? And is it lethal or is it just partially cumbersome? So some examples of these threats that could influence rarity is overharvest by humans, like we might see in American ginseng, or the invasive parasite that influences our American chestnut. So we have some of these examples that could lead to more rarity based on these additional threats. So when we're talking about species rarity rankings, I'm referring to what's called the NatureServe ranking system, which takes all of the information from all 50 states plus DC, their natural heritage program data, and compiling it into a larger data set. So each state heritage program assigns rarity rankings to their species, and those are the S ranks. That's going to be 1 through 5, 5 being the most secure and 1 being the most critically imperiled. NatureServe then takes all of those S ranks and then uses them to assign a G rank or a global rank to those species and ecosystems as well. It's the same trend, 5 being secure, 1 being most critically imperiled. So when we go to NatureServe and look at their Explorer tab, we can look at a certain species, look at their whole range that we're aware of, and look at the state rankings. You can see their color assigned on the map, but also look at the G rank up top. So just a quick few examples of how G rank can vary based on the species. Here we have American chestnut. Um, just like you all were discussing a few minutes ago, these have been just mostly decimated throughout its range. They still persist in the understory because their roots can resprout, but they're not really functioning. Very few reach sexual maturity and can reproduce. So because they're still present on the landscape, but they're not reproducing normally, these are considered G3 globally very vulnerable despite its large range. Another similar example is that American ginseng. Overall, it has a pretty wide range habitat. It shows up in a lot of different habitats, but it's also G3 globally vulnerable because it can easily be overharvested. Now, on the flip side, you can have a species that's ranked G3, such as our shale barren evening primrose, that's globally vulnerable because it has an extremely small and limited range. This is a mid-Appalachian endemic species that only occurs in 4 states and therefore has rankings at the state level and rankings at the G level. So, what is the point of this? And really, it all comes down to biodiversity, being able to protect both local, state, and regional biodiversity because the more species and ecosystems that we have on a landscape is going to lead to greater overall forest health, stability, and resilience. And being able to look at these rare species and ecosystems and be able to track changes in their populations can help inform us on how species diversity is changing over time in response to human impacts or climate change, invasive species, etc. And all of that information is going to be important to help ensure that we can protect our species and also help prioritize management and resource protection for resource managers. So now just kind of jumping into Maryland. Maryland itself is really special. It is a very small state compared to other states in the region, but we still have remarkable biodiversity. And a lot of that is because we still capture diversity through five different geographic regions. We have the coastal plain, the Piedmont, the Blue Ridge, the Ridge and Valley, and the Appalachian Plateau. Because the Potomac River cuts horizontally through these provinces, we're able to capture diversity throughout and support a lot of different species. We can have southern species present, especially along the coast where it's warmer. We can have a lot of more northern distributed species showing up in the western area because it's cooler. A lot of our really peculiar outcrop communities support several western disjunct species. And of course, the Potomac River system also supports a whole other suite of species related to the riparian zone. So Maryland itself has a lot of different habitat heterogeneity, which is then going to support higher levels of species diversity. Also, not to mention what's special about Maryland is the elevational gradient. Especially in Western Maryland, we can see that a lot of habitat variation can come just from topography and the soils, especially that are related to the geology of our landscape. So, getting to Western Maryland, right? Another reason why we should care about this is that it's part of our community keystones. Whether it be species growing in association with the cliff faces of Maryland Heights in Washington County, or Paw Paw Tunnel in Allegheny, or near Swallow Falls in Garret. A lot of these landscapes are in our backyard, and it's really fun and special if you're able to recognize not just the common, but the other species that make these areas really, really special. So from here, I'm going to start with Washington and then work our way west and just talk about a couple of my favorite ecosystems of these counties, and just highlight a few species that you might encounter in these special habitats. So Washington County especially has a lot of limestone and calcareous soils. The Great Valley of the Ridge and Valley, which is primarily used for agriculture because of those rich soils, can really support a lot of really special plants. That calcareous soil, those cove forests, can have really, really sweet basic soil that can support a suite of wildflowers, spring ephemerals. And one of my favorite habitats of this region are calcareous cliffs and glades. So any kind of limestone or more calcareous rock outcrop or cliff face. Um, these habitats are characterized by oaks and hickories, but especially some limestone loving trees such as you have a lot of basswood, shumard oaks, or also hamamelis. Witch hazel is common as well, and lots of beautiful wildflowers in the understory, including hydrangea and beautiful shooting star, which we're going to start with first. This species isn't super rare. It's S3 or vulnerable in Maryland. But I really love shooting star because it can be an indicator species of that higher quality limestone cliff habitat. This is in the primula family, and the flowers of this species are just really, really gorgeous. And what I love about this picture on the right is that it's growing in association here with another very rare plant. That white flowered plant is spreading rock cress, or Arabis potens. This is a very rare mustard that is actually G3. It's globally vulnerable. And if you look at its range map that I've added here from NatureServe, that's its entire global range. So the red states are S1, critically imperiled, orange is S2, imperiled, and S3 is vulnerable, so still tracked by the state heritage program, but not as threatened. And the reason why Maryland is yellow as opposed to red or orange is because we support most of the not most, but many populations of this species in the state. So a lot of those really rich limestone cliffs in Washington County support this globally rare plant, this little mustard. It's really adorable. Um, and that's just a really fun species that I love to encounter here, often growing with shooting star and other species like our bubblet fern. So this is another S3 species, not super rare, but I love including ferns here and there because sometimes they're overlooked. A lot of people are a little afraid to work on ferns, but I really love the bubblet fern. And it's called this because not only can it reproduce by spores, but it also can reproduce by making little clonal bubles or little bubblets attached to the underside, which you can see here in the photo on the right. You can see that little clone starting to grow on the underside of the frond. Here's another photo that shows a sexually mature individual. You can see the spores fully mature, ready to be dispersed, but also lots of little clonal growths on the undersides of the leaves and frond as well. So that's another fun one that explicitly grows on rock outcrops of those limestone cliffs. Now, you guys were mentioning trilliums, and I am also extremely ready to see some trilliums. And one of the most gorgeous ones in our region is the snow trillium, Trillium nivale. And this is a globally uncommon species. This is G4, and it's uncommon throughout our region. There is currently only one extant population of this plant in Maryland that I'm aware of, and it's currently protected within Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park. It grows along the Potomac River. And I've gotten to see this population once, and they're just so beautiful. They're very dainty, much smaller than other trillium species, and they come out a bit earlier. So these should be popping out just in the next few weeks. And if you're in that general area, I highly recommend going to check those out if you can. And then the last species of this habitat type that I want to introduce you to is another globally rare plant. This is another G3 globally vulnerable species. And this is tall larkspur, Delphinium exaltatum. This species is really cool. It grows on very specialized outcrop communities that are also shaded, so they tend to be a little bit more mesic, but still on outcrops. And this is a very tall larkspur species. They can grow up to 3 or 4 feet tall. And just one of my favorite little things about this whole genus is a nod to the genus name. The genus name is Delphinium, which is taken from the Greek root Delphini, which means womb, which is also the root that's been assigned to the Greek word for dolphin, a fish with a womb, essentially. And the flower buds, especially on the photo on the right, you can see how the flowers kind of look like little dolphins, which up close, when you take a look at those flowers, are just super adorable little dolphin flowers. So the next time you see a delphinium, check that out. Okay, so moving on to Allegheny County. This is where I've spent the most amount of time in the last couple of years. And that is because I'm a big fan of rock outcrops, and we have a lot of that in Allegheny. We have a lot of shale, we have a lot of limestone, a lot of siltstones and mudstones, and that has, coupled with all of our creek systems here, supported a lot of my favorite ecosystem type, the mid-Appalachian shale barrens. So this is a globally rare habitat itself. Just the habitat occurs only in a few states. And because it's a rare habitat, it also is going to support very specific endemic and endemic species. So if we take a look at this habitat, this is where we see a lot of geology coming into play. We typically have very steep slopes that are characterized of shale that have been undercut by some kind of water system that makes erosion occur pretty regularly. They also tend to be on south and west facing slopes where they get a lot of sun. Also, because they're on a steep slope, they can't retain a lot of water. So they're also super droughty and very dry, especially when facing that southern hot sun. So because of that, they tend to be very poor in terms of diversity in the herbaceous layer. Here's a picture of one standing on a shale barren, not a lot growing in the understory. The overstory is characterized of drought tolerant species like Virginia pine, pignut hickory, eastern red cedar, chestnut oak, things like that. But in the understory, we do get some specialized plants, such as the beautiful bird's foot violet, probably my favorite violet species. And that's a good shale barren indicator species. So where you find bird's foot violet, you're probably going to find something else pretty cool. including one of my favorite shale barren associates is the American harebell, Campanula intercedens. This used to be Campanula rotundifolia, but was just updated taxonomically recently. And these can also be found on limestone, but especially in Allegheny County, I tend to see these on outcrop communities near and adjacent to shale barrens. You can see on the NatureServe map that these are common in Western Maryland, and they're also tracked in adjacent West Virginia and Virginia, so uncommon throughout its range in the southern mid-Atlantic. Also in these habitats, we have the Ozark milkvetch, Astragalus distortus, and this is a very fun little legume species. Something that you're going to see across species of this habitat is that they tend to be short in stature. When you're on this shale barren habitat, because you're in full sun most of the time, you don't need to compete for sunlight. So plants don't need to spend this extra energy building a large scaffolding system and growing really tall to get sunlight. They can grow close to the ground, and that's going to help them prevent water loss and help minimize their surface area to prevent damage from solar radiation. So a lot of the plants in these open habitats tend to be small, like this cute little milk vetch. They have beautiful pinkish purplish flowers, and they're just like any other legume. They have this beautiful kind of butterfly shaped flower. And what's really peculiar about this species is that it is a Western disjunct. So if you look at the partial range map that I included, you can see that in the east, it's only found in 3 states, West Virginia, Maryland, and Virginia. Um, and it is very separate. It's disjunct from the rest of its western range where it's relatively common throughout. So this is a cool example of a vicariant population. These species were once connected, and then over time they've become separated by some kind of land barrier. This is also treated as a variety distortus, and the western populations are variety engelmannii. And there is some research being done on this species looking at genetics by Dr. Andrea Weeks at George Mason University. And so be on the lookout for publications on that in the next couple of years. Just another couple pictures of this plant because they're super cute, especially the photo on the right. You can see that as the flowers have senesced or are dying back, those green tubes that are pushing out of the calyx there are the young legumes, the young little pea-like fruits that are pushing out and becoming developing there. So also in these shale barren habitats, this is where I mentioned we have a lot of endemic species or species that are found only in these habitats. And this is one of them, the shale barren ragwort, Pachyra antenariifolia. So it looks like a lot of other pachyras in terms of flowers, but the foliage especially is very silvery, and the extra hairs on those leaves that give it that silvery appearance is going to help prevent solar damage and help prevent water loss. So that's a nice little adaptation for these hot, dry, shaly habitats. And you can see the range map. The states that it occurs in the most, Maryland, West Virginia, and Virginia, are S3, they're vulnerable. And that's because where you have shale barrens, they are growing all over it. So they can be locally abundant, but only on these particular habitats. Um, but this species is still G4, globally uncommon because it's endemic to just this region. Another shale barren endemic that's often growing in association with these species is the shale barren evening primrose, which is a beautiful Enothera species, Argillicola. And again, you can see this growing right on the shale outcrops. Has a big, beautiful yellow flower. It's very big for a primrose. And that stigma sticking out, you can see that characteristic cross-shaped stigma of the evening primroses. And again, in the range map, this is its entire global distribution. It occurs only in 4 states in the entire world, but where it does occur, it can be locally abundant, and it is globally vulnerable, G3. Also in these habitats is another special endemic with other characteristics of those other species we saw. They can be small, flat, growing to the ground. And this is one of our few native trifolium species, one of our few native clovers, and one of the most beautiful, I think. This is Kate's mountain clover, Trifolium virginicum. And you can see the beautiful small individual flowers of this species, typical legume. But what's cool about this plant too is that other adaptations have been acquired to help thrive in these weird habitats. So you can see that as the flowers have senesced in the photo on the left, that as the flowers have given rise to seed, rather than trying to disperse those seeds really far away from the parent like most plants do, they just lay their flower heads straight flat on the ground. And that's an adaptation to help ensure that their seeds are going to germinate in a habitat that's going to support them. So they'd rather have competition with the parent than have their seeds dispersed somewhere where they're not going to survive. So that's a cool kind of evolutionary trade off that we see, especially in this species, that we don't see as often in typical plant world. And then the next photo I have is just a really pretty up close picture of those senescent flower heads with the mature seeds. They become this really pretty fuchsia color, really distinctive. Again, just a really attractive clover species. Also adjacent to these limestone, calcareous shale barren habitats, we can also have a really unique milkweed species called climbing milkvine. Um, and so this is a milkweed relative. It's a vine. They have large opposite leaves. And if you were to cut the plant in any way, it would have that milky latex like other milkweeds have. But they have these really bizarre flowers that kind of look like aliens in some way. But I think they're so cute. The petals are twisty. You can see them twisting as they go. They can range from being like a fuchsia color to a dark maroon to a dark purple. And you tend to see these in early successional habitats. So this species especially is uncommon and threatened. You can see it's S1 in our state because of habitat succession. In these really dry habitats, we would naturally have fire occurring on the landscape, especially on the mountaintops where the trees would grow in, and that would help prevent establishment from species or from woody species in the more open habitats from encroaching. And with the lack of natural fire and more human suppressed fire, we're starting to see a lot more succession in these habitats and therefore habitat loss of this species. So these tend to be on the margins of these openings, not quite in full sun, but not under a canopy. So again, this is one especially needing some kind of habitat management for this to remain in our area and really thrive. Another habitat in Allegheny County I want to talk about are some of the riparian scour zones that are usually adjacent to those cool shale barren communities. So I mentioned that shale barrens are typically maintained by being undercut by water, and that is what leads to that shale erosion. But along these same river and creek communities, we tend to have outcrop bedrock communities that simulate a prairie. So river scour, along with just the bare bedrock, is very stressful and it simulates a more open prairie like habitat where trees can't become established. And within these rock crevices and in some of the mud flats associated with those cobbles, we have a G2 globally imperiled, federally endangered species, Harparella, which is Harparella nodosa. This is a very unique carrot family member. It's an annual plant, so they can be especially influenced by seasonal fluctuations year to year. And they grow in these little rock outcrop cobble bars in some of these slow moving creeks throughout Allegheny County. Um, and they're just really unique. They grow by the hundreds when you do find them, but they're very few and far between. And again, this is a really rare species. And if we look at the range map, you can see that they reach their northernmost range periphery in Maryland. So the populations that we have protected in Maryland are especially important in terms of potential northward migration for this species in response to climate change. The last plant that I want to talk to you guys about in Allegheny County is the tall blazing star. And this was a really exciting find for me a couple of years ago. This is Liatris spicata that until then was only known from one county in Maryland, growing at Soldier's Delight on the Serpentine Barrens. But I was really excited to find a new occurrence of this in Allegheny County. growing in one of these really unique outcrop communities. So, still a prairie like open grassland habitat growing in association with other grassland plants like big blue stem and other grasses. Um, and so, yeah, so now we have a new county that this species occurs in a similar but very disjunct habitat. And then, of course, going to the westernmost corner of Western Maryland is Garrett County. And this area is much higher in elevation. So, a lot of the habitat types here are driven by cooler temperatures as well as topography, based on, in addition to what kind of soil types you have. So, this is especially important with one of our very, very special habitats that we have in Western Maryland, which is related to our wetlands. Our high elevation wetlands are bogs and fens. So these are habitats that are associated with limestone or other calcareous bedrock. And they are going to create pretty much just a wet bowl of stagnant water that's usually nutrient poor. The water doesn't move very quickly. And depending on how the water is put into the system, if it's primarily rainwater or if it's primarily leakage through the water table, is going to influence the pH, which can also influence the species that it supports. But as you can imagine, just looking at this habitat, it can be very, very stressful. You can see a pretty finite line where the forest edge meets the bog. And that's because typical overstory trees are not going to be able to persist in a super wet, very nutrient poor soil regime. Also, being in full sun on top of those other hydrological stressors can also result in a very unique flora. The first of which being our wild Calla palustris. This photo was by Jim Brighton. The other ones were by me, but this one's by Jim. And a very special occurrence of this one. If we look in Western Maryland, this occurs in our frost pocket swamps, which is a special habitat of high elevation that helps capture cold air, a frost pocket, and it simulates much more northern boreal habitats. So you can see that this species is relatively widespread to the north, but in Maryland, we support the southernmost occurrence of this species. So this also has big implications for management, especially in light of a changing climate in terms of northward migration. This habitat or this population is especially at risk, based on its ability to move or have adjacent habitat for it to migrate to. So the fact that they show up here is really, really special and something that we want to work to preserve and maintain, especially with climate change. Also, in these special high elevation bogs and fens, we have bog Jacob's ladder, which is a G3 globally vulnerable, beautiful Jacob's ladder species. Um, you can see the foliage there on the left is shaped like a little like rungs on a ladder. And the flowers of this species are a beautiful deep purple. We do have the common Jacob's ladder species that's generally shorter in stature. This species, Van Bruntier, Pulmonium Van Bruntier, can get very tall. Um, and they're in these swamps. They're typically associated with black ash, which is also a uncommon to rare species in our region. But these species are especially influenced or at risk from deer browse. A lot of the plants of stems of these plants that I've seen, especially in the photo, you can see one in the background that's been chomped. The deer just love to eat these. So that's one thing, considering deer exclosures could be one way to help protect these populations. And then I just want to end my presentation for the orchid folks. I just want to talk about a couple orchids that are also special and can be found in Western Maryland in these seepage swamps and high elevation bogs. One of them being Platanthera paramoena, the purple fringeless orchid. So this is a very rare orchid. It's S1 in the state. Um, they can get very tall, and I love especially the spurs on these flowers. The photo on the right, most of the flowers haven't quite opened up, but on the back of the flower bud, you can see that fun little twisty spur on the back, um, which is just a fun little piece of orchid flower morphology I love to look for. And then also in this area, we have another Platanthera species, the Platanthera grandiflora, the large purple fringed orchid. which is S2 in the state, also found in seepage swamps. And you can see those beautiful fringes on the petals of that. And these are just a couple of the native Platanthera species and just a fraction of the native orchids that we have throughout the state, but especially in Western Maryland. So I could talk to you guys about rare plants all night, but I just want to stop there and talk about just a couple themes that we've seen. And that is just that Western Maryland, just like every other part of the state, supports remarkable biodiversity. Lots of cool different habitats, some of them that are biodiversity hotspots and support species that you can't find anywhere else um, in the state or globally, a lot of really special, globally rare habitats. Um, so they can also be of great importance in terms of maintaining overall biodiversity throughout the region. Some of these plants that are rare throughout the region, the populations that we have can be very important for maintaining genetic diversity, supporting migration, as I mentioned before, um, and they can also be the basis for future studies and other indicators of habitat health and maintenance and conservation. So speaking of conservation, again, some of the themes that we saw with a lot of these plants were common threats, including habitat loss, invasive species, loss of natural disturbance regimes, and climate change, especially with these habitats that are insular in nature. They're not connected to other occurrences of the same habitat, and therefore are at a higher risk of loss as we have a rapidly changing climate. It also allows us to make priority for conservation, both locally, state, and also regionally. Using the state rank rarity values as well as the global rarity values can help natural heritage folks, as well as yourself. If you own land or if you know people who do, if you're out and about, or just helping educate other people that you know about the biodiversity that's in our area and what we can do to protect it, can really go a long way. And again, just helping maintain those habitats and allowing this information to help inform other future studies and maintenance initiatives can be very, very important for some of the smallest but most special species that we have in our region. So I just want to thank you guys again for having me this evening. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I love talking about our beautiful native plants. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
There is a question here. Um, what was the plant in the last picture?
That last plant is a really fun one. It's called rock harlequin or pink corydalis. It's found on rock outcrops in Western Maryland. I believe it's S3 in the state, and it's in the fumitory family. So it's closely related to the little yellow fumitories that you'll see in the springtime, as well as Dutchman's britches and your wild bleeding heart.
Wendy, you can go ahead and unmute.
Oh, thank you. So, this was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. One question I had, given the, you know, the fragile nature of the populations that we're discussing, are there efforts to cultivate them either as tissue culture or as plants in various facilities to try and maintain them, given the fact that habitat loss and climate change are such threats?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not sure about other agencies, but I do know for a fact that C&O Canal National Historical Park is currently several years into a propagation project in association with Mount Cuba Center. So the last several years, they have been collecting fruit and seed from all of the rare plants in along the canal. Mount Cuba Center has been propagating them, and they have recently, starting this year, been planted in situ back into those original habitats, which is really exciting. A couple examples I know off the top of my head. First is the American gooseberry. That's an S1 species that only occurs in one population in C&O Canal. And they were able to make a clone of that and add that back in to the population, as well as another very rare species called Virginia mallow. It's a mallow species called Ripariosida hermaphrodita. That species was able to get seed collected from a nearby DC population and then planted back into the Great Falls area where it used to occur. So there are lots of other species that they're doing, but those are two really rare ones that they're working on. That's just really exciting. Thanks for that question.
Sharon, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
I live in Cumberland, Maryland, and I like to go kayaking and look for plants and ecosystems. And sometimes I go on the northern branch of the Potomac River. It's pretty shallow, so I scrape bottom sometimes. But there's, I don't know if you have any suggestions. I know you're in Frostburg of some interesting places to go to kind of watch from the shorelines.
Yeah, so I also am a big kayaker, but I haven't been kayaking much here since I moved here. But what has been on my list has to kayak on the Potomac through the Paw Paw Bends.
Okay.
So especially through that section of the Potomac near pretty much between Paw Paw and Little Orleans, you can see some of the largest and most beautiful examples of mid-Appalachian shale barren from the river.
Okay.
And especially if you have binoculars, you might be able to see some cool plants. But yeah, that region, at least to me, has been on my list. And I look forward to hopefully floating through that region soon.
That sounds great. If you need a companion, I'll meet you somewhere.
Sounds great, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Christina,
Yeah. When you talk about the Liatris, I think it was Liatris picara, is there any record in the serpentine barrens in the Eastern Shore? Self-serving question.
Sorry, is there currently a record there?
Yes. Yeah, I'm wondering if it's has not been found or because I don't remember you have any reference to that part of the state.
Yeah, so it is currently known from the serpentine barrens at Soldier's Delight. That is the known occurrence of that species in the state. But the new occurrence that we have is out in Washington or in Allegheny County. I don't know if the plant atlas has been updated yet, but a copy or sorry, the voucher specimen that I collected has been sent to Heritage. So they have that reference material to update the atlas.
Okay. Look it up. Thank you.
Yeah.
and Margaret Chatham, you had a comment about Ruellia.
Yeah, if I read it correctly and remembered right, your first picture was of Ruellia humilis listed as S1. And I just find that surprising because I don't really know what the source was, but somebody gave some of those plants to the Potomac chapter of the Virginia Native Plant Society. And like all Ruellia, it throws its seeds when they're ripe, and it is now almost a weed in our propagation beds. And so it just surprised me that it was S1.
Yeah, that's a great comment because a lot of species that are rare throughout their range actually do quite well when they are maintained in a nursery or even just in a garden setting. Especially that species of Ruellia, it loves sun, but it also needs to be maintained to where there isn't a lot of disturbance. So comically, that species throughout its range, one of the biggest habitats that tend to support that species is in graveyards that are regularly mowed and maintained as open. You'll see just a sea of Ruellia humilis. So where we have it in Maryland, where I'm familiar with it, it occurs on small rock outcrops, especially along trails. I've seen them growing right in the middle of a walking trail. They're okay with the disturbance, they just need the full sun. So they'll hang out in some bizarre areas like that. So I'm lucky you for having it in your garden. It's a beautiful little plant.
Steve Walker, do you want to go ahead and unmute and you can ask your question?
So of the rare plants that have been discussed in this talk, which have highly specialized pollinators, and do the decreasing numbers of these pollinators also contributing to their rarity?
Yeah, that is a super excellent question. Um, a lot of flowers are pretty generalistic. They can support a number of different pollinators, but some are very specific. Um, of the ones I discussed, I can't think of one right off the top of my head that might have a specific pollinator, but that's actually a question that I'm interested in asking. I'm currently working on my PhD, and a chapter that I want to focus on is looking at, are the pollinators that are primarily pollinating these rare plants, are they also rare? If they are found in these rare
Mm-hmm.
ecosystems, are they as equally uncommon as
Right.
the habitat that supports them?
Mm.
So that's one question, but also what I've read in the literature is that especially for insular ecosystems that are far dispersed from another similar habitat type, most of the insects that are pollinating the plants are large-bodied generalists. The larger the pollinator, the farther area it can go and travel between those insular ecosystems. So that's a really cool question. There are a couple different hypotheses we could have, but that's a great point to raise, that especially with climate change too, changing phenologies of the plants and the insects could lead to a mismatch, which could really influence fecundity in the future.
Nancy, you have a question?
Clara, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I think we've all learned a lot and enjoyed your photography throughout it. I have a question for you about the climate for Western Maryland. I think this winter has been more of a typical winter with the snow and the cold temperatures. Does that usually produce a greater profusion of these spring ephemerals that we typically see out there?
Well, it's going to vary on a few things. Temperature, a lot of these plants are adapted to being in hibernation in the winter, and the coldness itself may or may not influence them. The biggest things that's going to influence the spring ephemerals is when we start to get warmed back up. The number of growing degree days can influence when things start to pop up. And then, of course, if we have a freeze following that, that could really prevent some flowers from really having a beautiful bloom that spring. But what I think is going to happen is that we're going to have a really good showing of spring ephemerals this year because we finally got a lot of snow. At least in Western Maryland, some of the last few years we haven't gotten that much snow, but this year we got a lot, which is going to be a lot more water and hopefully really fuel some of those flowering species and get a good show. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, thank you. Sounds good.
Michael?
Clara, thanks so much. Friend of mine in high school graduated from Frostburg State, so I feel certain affinity. I was wondering about these shale barrens. Now, if the shale is found in a valley underlaying a flat topography, then it would be considered a very rich soil or very providing a lot of nutrients to anything. But if it's on a close to a vertical topography, then it's nutrient poor. Is there what do you do with, intermediate slopes that are maybe 45 degrees or maybe something else? Is there some angle at which point the nutrient richness of the shale is suddenly overcome or let's say neutralized by the slope, and it becomes a barren even though this underlying rock is the same?
Yeah, good question. So the nutrients from the shale, just like you were saying, especially in a bottomland, that can be really nutritious, and you can have a lot of beautiful spring ephemerals that just love all that extra nutrients from those alluvial soils downstream. But especially on that steep slope, there is still generally with shale barrens a good layer of soil underneath the shale. So a lot of those specialists that we discussed today actually have another cool adaptation that I didn't mention, and that tends to be having a really long taproot. And that's going to allow them to just anchor onto the side of that shale, just regardless of the depth, the angle of the slope. and really anchor in, still be able to harness the water that's in that soil despite those layers of shale that are getting super hot, just baked in the sun on top of the soil. So the soil itself is still has nutrients that are able to be accessed. It's just the main part that's really stressing out that habitat is just the heat, the solar radiation that's just blasting through that thin canopy.
Rick, you have a comment that you made in the chat?
I did. I was responding to Steve Lonker's question about specialized pollinators. I also don't know much about specialized pollinators in a shale barren habitat, but snow trillium in particular is critically dependent on ants to transport the seeds. You know, they have a little fat pocket on top of the seeds that ants find very nutritious, and they will collect the seeds, carry them back to their nest, and feed the fat to their little grubs. And once that's done, the seeds lay there, and it's a perfect place for them to germinate. The problem, I think, and we're seeing this with a lot of our native ant species, is that they're under tremendous pressure by non-native ant species, and I think that's going to be a real issue for a lot of the plants that are dependent on myrmecophagy, the transport of seeds by plants. And also for a lot of our hair streak and blue butterflies, which depend on specific native ants to tend the caterpillars and keep them safe.
Do you want to unmute, Michael?
Is it true that many or most or all violet species also depend on ants, or at least are assisted by ants in their seed dispersal by the same mechanism? And would they be threatened by these non-native invasive ants, which is I've heard about today for the first time?
I am by no means an ant expert, but I am pretty sure that violets also have that fleshy elaeosome that they mentioned in the chat. It's also pretty common for a lot of our wildflowers that are low growing like that, to have fruits that are dispersed by ants and beetles and other small things that can pick them up and move them around. But yeah, that's a great, my favorite thing about native plants as I've gotten more familiar with them is thinking about their role in the ecosystem and how they're interacting with their pollinators and their dispersers and how they interact with other organisms in the system. And that's just my favorite thing about science is that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And there are so many fun things to learn about, especially just in your own backyard. So thanks for bringing that up.
Sharon, you have another question?
There is a walk at the top of the Bishop Walsh High School, and there's a water tower up there, if you know, in Cumberland. It's Haystack Mountain, and there are a lot of things up there, shrubs and trees that are native, and incredible views of the mountains. And you've probably been up there, I'm assuming. And do you have any reflections on that little stretch of land? And I think it's trying to be a park. Yeah,
so that is part of the Narrows, which is probably, one of the most well-known parts of Cumberland, especially on the other side of the mountain. Wills Mountain is, of course, a state park now, and they are working on getting protections for that area. Last spring, I actually went out that same area that you just mentioned. I went out with the state botanist to help search for a couple previous occurrences of rare plants that grow there. We didn't find what we were looking for, but it is a really beautiful spot. A lot of typical species you would see in those rock outcrop communities, like beautiful mountain laurel, some of our mountain hollies. It would surely be a beautiful place to check out in the spring when all of that's flowering as well.
Michael Welper's had another follow-up question.
Yeah, it's I know this talk isn't about ants, but because they affect native plants, I'm just wondering if Rick or anybody else can put in the chat some good resources on these non-native invasive ants, which are as worrisome suddenly as when I first learned about the non-native invasive worms. But anyway, Rick or the others, if you have any resources on NNI ants and what anybody's doing about it. If anything can be done, it'd be great.
Rick, you had another comment about viola?
Sure, I can take both of those at once, actually. There isn't really a very good introduction or guide to how important ants are in Maryland. Typically, what we know about ants and their relationship both to the butterfly species that I'm most interested in and the plant species is because we have a particular endangered plant and we're finding out that that's how it is most likely to be dispersed. Violets, many violets also have an eliosome. They have a little fat burrito that ants like to eat, but most violets, and I'm wondering here particularly about bird's foot violet, but most violets that we normally think of as, you know, your standard run-of-the-mill violets, tend to have pretty good ability to have their seeds dispersed. Anyway, many of them have, you know, spring mechanisms that you know, force the seeds out and other things so that they're not as critically dependent on ants for their transport as, say, the snow trilliums or some of our other trilliums are. And the seeds for violets tend to be a lot more easy to germinate. A lot of times the issue with the ants is that the seeds germinate really, really well inside the ant nest because it's warmer, it's a nutrient-rich environment, and so that tends to be a, you know, sort of a twofer for them. But I don't think that's quite as the case with many of our more common violets. But I wouldn't say that there may not be rarer violets that may require myrmecophory or ant transport to get their seeds dispersed.
Thank you, Rick.
Yep.
Jeff, you have a question.
So you mentioned the fringeless purple orchid, and I have a farm in Carroll County, and in the 20 years I've been here, I've found it twice along, you know, I have a kind of a stream wetland network, and I've found it twice. It literally screams at you. It's so intense. But, you know, is that once it blooms, is that the end of its life cycle? Because I'll go back and then I can't find it.
So that's a great question. Orchids are perennial. They will come back, or they're still alive underground. Um, so what's weird or bizarre about orchids, though, is that they're very finicky, and they also take a lot of energy to flower. As you've noticed, that beautiful spectacle of flowers that they have takes a lot of energy to make. So it's not uncommon for orchids, especially, to take a year off or a couple years off, sometimes 10 years off, but they will still be alive underground. They just won't flower or come above ground that year. So when you've refound it, it's the same plant that you're finding. It's just taken a year off, the years that you don't see it.
Well, hopefully I've found two because they were in different spots, and hopefully someday I'll get the show again. But thank
Awesome.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, in addition, of course, orchids are some of the species that are incredibly dependent on the mycorrhizae. So that's why they can go for years without even producing, for instance, a leaf, because they're they're being fed by the mycorrhizae underground. And sometimes my understanding is that they need to get energy together, and sometimes they need to wait for just the right conditions to come up. And I see we have a question first by Linda. You can unmute yourself.
I actually have the same question that was just asked, excuse me, only in regards to Trillium. When we lived in Upper Baltimore County or Northern Baltimore County, one year we noticed Trillium in the woods in between two properties. Every year I looked for it. It took about, I'd say, 5 years to find it again. And it wasn't that we missed it, I just don't think it bloomed. So is it another plant that is finicky or certain conditions or takes a year or two off?
Someone here might know Trillium a little bit better than me, but from what I understand with Trillium especially, they are very long-lived species. So a lot of times when you see them vegetatively or they're not as showy, they might just be young species. The species that I've encountered, they tend to flower once they are at sexual maturity. So if they're not flowering, that could be from a couple reasons. And something I've noticed a lot is deer browse. If they pop up above ground and then get munched, they're not going to be able to really recover from that, and they just won't flower again that season. Um, that's what I have to offer. But if anybody else is more familiar and wants to jump in, please feel free.
Margaret, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Just to add a little more to the Plantathera paramoena, that is a species that has occurred at Fraser Preserve at least since, known there at least since 1978. And I have seen it just as was reported sporadically. And there was, up until a couple of years ago, I had seen it multiple times, but never twice in the same place. And then we hit a really good year for it, and a bunch of the ones that had come up before reappeared. And I just decided, yes, this is something that is going to hide underground after it's bloomed until it's been able to steal enough from the surrounding ecosystem by way of the fungi. And then it'll pop up and enjoy it while it's there, because it's not going to be in the same place next year.
Thank you. All right, last call for questions. I'm seeing a lot of thank yous in the chat, and fabulous or excellent presentation, wonderful and informative. So Clara, I think that you are a hit here.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Again, this is a really exciting topic. I love sharing. So I'm really appreciative that you guys asked me to come back and give another talk. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.